People tried to box you in with their own illusions of superiority, thinking you were soft clay they could mold, manipulate, and toss aside. But what they didn't see coming was the moment the mirror shattered. The reflection they saw wasn't the weakling they assumed, it was the catalyst of their undoing. The blow wasn't loud or violent. It was silent, surgical, and divine. What collapsed wasn't just their ego, it was the entire fantasy world they built around their control. You didn't just push back, you reset the whole balance. And now they're left crawling through the ruins, haunted by the fact that the person they dismissed so easily was always carrying silent thunder in their bones. You are here for a reason. If you feel the call, answer it. Click Join to unlock exclusive content, deep insights, and a powerful community. This isn't just a membership, it's an awakening. Step into your divine purpose. Join the chosen. It started like a dream, a magnetic presence, carefully composed glances, words that wrapped around the soul like silk. The kind of attention that seems sacred. But beneath it all, there was calculation. Each compliment was a test. Each gesture, a lure. They'd studied the art of illusion, believing they could choreograph your surrender. They saw kindness and confused it with craving. They saw empathy and mistook it for emptiness. They thought they could lead you like a moth into fire, but what they touched wasn't longing. It was light, and not the kind they could control. Their entire plan unraveled the moment your inner compass refused to be silenced. The soft warnings at first, quiet unease, questions you couldn't explain, soon became a flood of unshakable clarity. It wasn't logic that saved you. It was resonance. A feeling that their energy didn't match the harmony you'd worked so hard to build. Smiles that felt rehearsed. Eyes that never truly met yours. And then the shift, when the performance no longer impressed but disturbed. You weren't hypnotized. You were decoding. They saw your trust as naivety, but you were watching, listening, knowing. Not falling deeper. Rising higher. If you've been touched by God's goodness, don't keep it to yourself. Click Super Thank You, and sow a gift of $20 or more to help spread His light. Your giving becomes a ripple of grace, blessing hearts and building His kingdom. Let His overflow pour through you. Behind every still moment was an invisible process unraveling quietly. Reflexes sharpened without announcement. Thoughts began tracking patterns hidden between the lines. Mismatched tones, gaps in timing, a strange chill behind friendly eyes. The heart, once open by default, started locking its gates without needing reasons. It wasn't fear. It was preparation. An inner alignment began recalibrating, long before the mind could explain why. Something inside had detected the cracks in the illusion, and a subtle barricade was already forming in places once left wide open. The unraveling didn't begin when things got loud. It began the moment clarity whispered, "This isn't right." What rose from that inner recalibration was nothing short of seismic. A presence rooted in unshakable calm. The kind of stillness that doesn't budge when storms scream. Every veiled insult became irrelevant. Every attempt to confuse became transparent. The foundation had shifted, and now, no trick could pierce it. They tried to dismantle identity with passive jabs and clever twists of truth, but they weren't prepared for a soul that had anchored itself beyond reach. Not just surviving their tactics, but transcending them. No longer reactive, just solid. Hold that you're not here by chance. Feel the pull? Tap Join to unlock truth, purpose, and a tribe that gets it. This is more than a membership, it's your calling. Somewhere along the way, the dynamic inverted. What once fascinated began to frustrate. They couldn't digest the new equation. You no longer made yourself small to keep the peace. When access was denied, confusion turned to outrage. They couldn't comprehend how someone they thought they'd mapped out was now drawing borders they couldn't cross. What they wanted wasn't love, It was control dressed as affection. What they desired wasn't partnership. It was possession masked as interest. But entry was refused. Not in anger. Not in vengeance. Just in quiet, unapologetic sovereignty. That, to them, was the ultimate offense. What unfolded wasn't a disagreement. It was psychological warfare dressed in affection. Disguised as care, the strategies crept in with rehearsed sorrow, tailored blame, and theatrics meant to reshape your mind. Patterns emerged like invisible ink on aged parchment. Praise that froze mid-sentence, gestures with strings hidden behind smiles. One day they'd pretend you were everything. The next, they vanished into silence, leaving you chasing shadows. But this wasn't confusion. It was design. Crafted to weaken, to exhaust, to pull you into an endless maze where your identity was meant to unravel. Instead, the opposite happened. The moment you began to name what was happening, something irreversible awakened. The veil they wore lost its shimmer. Your words didn't just describe, it dismantled. The facade, once polished and convincing, now looked brittle and strange under your unfiltered vision. You weren't shaken by the show. You dissected it. While others clapped for the performance, you stood up mid-act and left. That was the rupture. The silence that followed your truth was louder than their entire orchestration. There was no longer any need for confirmation. Your sense of self operated independently of their narratives. Compliments held no currency. False admiration echoed hollow. You'd tasted something real in your life, and no imitation could ever satisfy again. The flattery felt recycled. The affection, transactional. You could smell the script behind the words, the pattern behind the passion. It wasn't paranoia. It was pattern recognition born from truth. And that made their most prized tactics fall flat. What revealed itself was stunning in its simplicity. They didn't know what love was. Not even a distorted version. What they carried was need, not devotion. A hunger dressed up as connection. The facade cracked because it was never supported by anything rooted. Their affection was a tool set. Their closeness, conditional. The unraveling began when they realized they couldn't teach you fear, and ended when you stopped entertaining their version of care. What stood before you wasn't a person. It was a role built on reflexes of conquest. They thrived in games where people begged to be seen. But you didn't beg. You didn't play. And the scripts they relied on started breaking apart in your presence. The desperation grew clearer, their need to latch onto others, to siphon safety, to pretend its stability while secretly decaying. They weren't interacting. They were feeding. But your energy stopped being available for the feast, and that, more than anything, made them collapse inward. There was no scream, no theatrical escape, no warning shot fired. Just a silence so complete it rang like thunder in a place where chaos had always been king. What shattered everything wasn't rage, it was your absence. A quiet, clean departure that left no trail to follow, no door ajar, no lingering warmth to crawl back toward. They never anticipated that someone so open, so forgiving, so full of grace would ever choose finality over fixing. But that's exactly what happened. And in doing so, you issued the most brutal truth of all. Some things aren't yours to carry, no matter how long you were manipulated into believing otherwise. There are rare ones who live among us, unshaken by noise, untethered by trends. Not saints, not saviors, just souls who see clearly. While others sleepwalk through borrowed dreams, they listen to the deeper hum, the sound behind the sound. Their loyalty is not to approval but to truth. Their power isn't loud, it's felt. They don't broadcast their wisdom, they simply are it. And when they speak, it isn't to convince, it's to awaken. If you've ever felt different in rooms that asked you to shrink, if you've ever held silence because noise couldn't handle your truth, then you already belong. No applications. No applause. just resonance. The collapse didn't start with your words. It began the second you stopped explaining. They had shaped their entire reality around the illusion that they were irresistible, indomitable, always in control. But what they couldn't anticipate was the power of non-response. No argument. No closure. Just distance, total and irrevocable. It wasn't just that you refused their version of the story. It was that you refused to play at all. And in that refusal, their imagined empire began to dissolve in their own hands. What cracked wasn't their pride, it was their mask. The one held together by rehearsed charm and years of perfecting the art of persuasion. You didn't just walk away, you revealed that none of it ever mattered. Their supposed magnetism didn't bind you. Their manipulation didn't sway you. Their promises didn't hold you. And that truth hit like a collapse from within. Not because you destroyed them, but because you refused to reflect the illusion they needed to survive. The show only worked if you stayed in your seat, and you got up and left without applause. The shift didn't come with thunder or spectacle. It came through a single, irreversible act that collapsed the entire power structure they believed they'd mastered. The one they thought would always bend was the one who broke the spell. And once the hold was severed, something shocking became undeniable. The image of control they clung to was nothing more than a projection built on dependency. When you exited the equation, what was left wasn't strength. It was a hollow framework, desperate to be filled by anyone willing to play along. But you weren't playing anymore. When the mask cracked, retaliation replaced reflection. What could have been a mirror became a megaphone of destruction. You watched as chaos was deliberately staged, not random, but rehearsed. Rumors took flight like well-rehearsed scripts handed out to anyone who might listen. You became the antagonist in a play you never agreed to join. Wild accusations were dropped like traps in every social circle you once shared. The effort wasn't to heal or reflect, it was to annihilate any version of the story where you were seen as whole, steady, and free. They didn't just want to punish your absence, they wanted to erase the evidence that you'd ever been sovereign. What they feared wasn't abandonment, it was exposure. Every whisper, every twist of your name, every false tale told behind closed doors was powered by one terror: the truth bleeding through their performance. This wasn't gossip for entertainment. It was a last-ditch effort to bury the very thing they couldn't defeat, your clarity. But you didn't engage. You didn't scramble to clear your name or chase explanations. You stood still while storms howled, not because you were frozen, but because you knew stillness was strength. Every attempt to provoke you fell flat because you didn't carry the wound they were trying to reopen. You had already healed. You were no longer hooked by the performance, no longer baited by emotional spectacle. You let the noise crash and burn outside your door, untouched. And while false fires burned, you were building. Quietly, steadily, relentlessly. You laid down foundations with new hands, ones no longer trembling from trauma. And that's when the contrast became impossible to ignore. You didn't need a stage or an audience. Your life became your proof. The difference between you and the one unraveling was visible from a mile away. Your joy was rooted. Theirs was borrowed. Your confidence grew in silence. Theirs only survived through attention. What they faked, you embodied. And that embodiment became your revolution. You weren't just healing, you were becoming. Stronger, clearer, lighter. You poured your strength into the soil of your own becoming and watched it bloom in places they swore would stay barren. You stopped trying to be understood, and started building a world that didn't require explanation. What you walked through didn't just leave you standing. It elevated you. And now, everything that tried to dismantle you must live with the truth. It didn't work. You rose. You stayed real. And they couldn't even fake that. The silent applause wasn't imagined, it was real. Not loud, not dramatic, but deeply felt. Every action you took during your journey became a reflection of quiet nobility. No need for revenge, no need to broadcast your pain. The way you carried the weight without bitterness, the way your truth held firm without arrogance, it moved people. Something in your steadiness reminded others what it meant to live with soul intact. And without even knowing it, you became a living example of integrity under fire. Those watching from the sidelines weren't just observing, they were awakening to their own dormant strength, inspired by the way you stood. What followed wasn't orchestrated. It was alignment. One by one, hearts began gravitating toward yours, not because you lobbied for loyalty, but because your frequency called to something ancient in them. The warmth you extended wasn't transaction, it was truth, and people could feel the difference. You weren't trying to be liked. You were simply being. And that state of being, genuine, grounded, generous, became the light that illuminated the kindred. Without performance, without compromise. Those who came into your orbit brought more than conversation. They brought reflection. And in their eyes, you saw echoes of yourself, not in form, but in essence. These weren't relationships formed out of survival or codependency. These were rooted connections, mutual, safe, whole. The kind of friendships where silence felt sacred and laughter became medicine. Here, you didn't have to explain your worth. It was known. You didn't have to prove your care. It was felt. And for the first time in a long time, you stopped bracing for disappointment, because these souls held you without agenda. The contrast between this circle and what you left behind became crystal clear. Gone were the days of overextending just to feel seen. Here, your presence alone was enough. Every word was received, every boundary respected, every gesture returned. And that sacred reciprocity reminded you what real love looks like in practice. Not loud promises, but quiet consistency. You realized how rare it is to be surrounded by people who actually see you, not just for what you do, but for who you are at rest. The beauty of it all was this. You didn't change yourself to find this place. You revealed yourself. The world around you simply adjusted to match that revelation. You didn't ask for validation. It came naturally. You didn't chase community. You became the signal that called it forth. And now, every moment spent in connection is layered with gratitude, because you remember what it felt like to be unseen, unheard, unheld. And you'll never return there again. You've built something different now. And this is real. The most astonishing twist in this entire unfolding was how flawlessly hidden your strength had been in plain sight. Everything about your essence, your compassion, your softness, your warmth, was misread by someone who lacked the spiritual lens to see depth beneath gentleness. While they scanned for easy victories, you stayed still, calm, observant, anchored. And when the reckoning came, it was seismic not because of its volume, but because of its precision. You didn't strike out in anger. You simply existed in truth. And that truth was more than their illusion could withstand. For someone so obsessed with control, you were the anomaly that short-circuited their blueprint. Their calculations required reactions, emotional outbursts, pleas for closeness, all the signs of dependence. But instead, they encountered silence that stung, presence that couldn't be pulled off center, and a gaze that saw straight through their curated persona. What was mistaken for passivity was actually wisdom. What looked like softness was self-mastery. You had long since outgrown the need for external approval, and in doing so, became unreadable to someone who relied on emotional currency to feel powerful. Plans had been made around the assumption that you were like everyone else they'd studied, eager to please, easily guilt, prone to shrinking. But what awaited them was something altogether different, a being that had already walked through fire, already learned how to be whole without applause. You didn't resist their attempts with effort, you nullified them with clarity. The more they tried to provoke, the more your stillness echoed. That silence. It was the mirror they couldn't bear to face. It exposed their performance for what it was: fragile, desperate, unrooted. And then came the shift. The hunter became the one overanalyzing every word. The manipulator began adjusting themselves to avoid your disapproval. The one who thrived off control started calculating how to win your acceptance. That reversal wasn't loud, but it was undeniable. Simply being yourself caused discomfort in someone who thought themselves untouchable. You didn't raise your voice. You raised the standard. And they couldn't reach it. This was never about revenge. It was about revelation. The kind of revelation that rewires everything. Not because you proved anything, but because you were never pretending. They projected weakness onto you, not realizing you had already transmuted it into wisdom. They planned for a game. You were living in purpose. And that disconnect, between the image they crafted and the truth they encountered, became their undoing. The second turning point hit with quiet finality. Someone truly believed they could sculpt your identity from the outside in. The assumption was that with enough repetition and pressure, your view of self could be overwritten, replaced with shame, doubt, and borrowed definitions that served their own emptiness. But what they didn't realize was that your roots ran too deep for their narratives to reach. Their projections slid off the surface of a being who had already excavated their worth long before manipulation tried to rewrite the story. Their voice never carried enough weight to disrupt the core truth you had already claimed within yourself. This wasn't just an ordeal, it was a sacred curriculum. Every misstep, every distortion you survived was a lesson encoded with higher instruction. You weren't just being tested, you were being equipped. It wasn't about pain for the sake of suffering. It was refinement. You had to learn what deception wears when it smiles. You had to feel what it's like to be drained by false intimacy so that real connection could never be mistaken again. You weren't losing time. You were earning spiritual muscle, strengthening discernment, and fortifying the boundaries that now protect your inner realm like sacred gates. And perhaps the most unexpected twist, your refusal to shrink enraged someone who had built their sense of power on the compliance of others. You became a mirror they couldn't handle. When you started honoring yourself over their image of you, it destabilized the illusion entirely. You walked away, not in rebellion, but in restoration. That clarity, choosing your own well-being over their emotional economy, became the quiet revolution that ended the cycle for good. They expected your loyalty. Instead, you gave yourself back to yourself. Now, because of what you've learned, something truly rare is approaching: love, but not the borrowed kind dressed in flattery. Love that echoes your depth, not your wounds. The kind that doesn't demand sacrifice of your soul just to feel secure. It's not fantasy, it's resonance. And it's drawn by who you've become in the aftermath of chaos. You'll recognize it not by intensity, but by peace. It won't chase you. It will find you, because it matches the version of you who no longer settles for partial truth. This was never punishment. It was preparation. You aren't arriving broken, you're arriving wise. And now the space around you has been cleared of illusions to make room for something sacred, something lasting, something real. Not just love that holds you, but love that sees you. The kind that knows your worth was never in question. The kind that doesn't dim your light, but reflects it back even brighter. The chapter that's coming will feel like recognition, not rescue. Because you're no longer searching, you've remembered. And that remembrance called in the very thing you were made for. What unfolded wasn't mere growth. It was a complete rewiring of how you interact with the world. You stopped trying to control outcomes, and instead became a source of them. Your presence alone began shifting timelines, not because you demanded attention, but because your energy calibrated everything around you. Wherever your focus landed, things flourished. People felt seen. Opportunities found you. And while others used force to take, you expanded through presence, planting intentions in alignment with purpose. That karmic detour you overcame wasn't failure. It was preparation. You weren't being punished. You were being sculpted into someone whose very existence commands elevation. The lessons embedded in that experience became your sacred armor. You didn't emerge with vengeance. You emerged with clarity. You proved that genuine power never needs to chase, perform, or prove. It simply exists, and it expands. Where others manipulated to gain control, you healed to gain vision. You stepped into yourself completely, building a foundation so grounded in self-honor that no distortion could breach it. The choice to walk away wasn't weakness, it was wisdom dressed in silence. You began showing others what liberation looks like when it comes from within, not from validation. Now your life reflects that internal shift. The reflection in your relationships has changed because you changed the way you see yourself. No more overgiving. No more explaining your value to people who never intended to honor it. You didn't become cold. You became selective. You didn't lose softness. You added standards. And those standards became the invitation for real love to enter. Not the fantasy that demands sacrifice, but the kind that amplifies your light, not competes with it. This love isn't meant to teach you pain. It's meant to honor your rebirth. And the most poetic irony of all? Someone poured everything into unraveling you, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, only to watch you thrive in ways they never imagined. While they were busy orchestrating damage, you were quietly building a new reality in which their influence had no reach. The power they thought they held was never real. It only existed inside their illusion. You didn't take that power from them. You simply stopped pretending they ever had it. You became immune to the performance, and in doing so, dissolved the entire narrative. What destroyed them wasn't your retaliation. It was your detachment. It was realizing they couldn't elicit a reaction from someone who no longer needed to be understood. You won not because you fought back harder, but because you chose peace over war. That's the kind of win that rewrites futures. You're no longer chasing potential. You're aligned with truth. And from that place, everything starts pouring in. Connections that reflect your essence, opportunities that match your purpose, and a love that's not built on need but on resonance. You didn't just walk away. You rose. And everything that couldn't match your frequency had no choice but to fall away.